The forest path leading to our grandparents' house was one we'd walked 100 times before. The trail wound through thick trees, their branches reaching overhead like a protective canopy, filtering the sunlight into soft patches on the dirt ground. I was with my younger brother, and we moved with the ease of familiarity, each step part of a well-known journey. Our grandparents' house sat just beyond the trees, at the edge of the woods, a warm and inviting beacon of safety. But that day, something felt different. About halfway along the path, we started noticing things scattered along the ground. I stopped, my eyes narrowing as I bent down to inspect what lay there. A small toy car, half buried in the dirt, its bright paint faded and scratched. A little further on, there was an old baseball glove, its leather cracked and worn. My brother picked up a doll, missing an eye, its face frozen in a hollow stare. "These shouldn't be here," I muttered, mostly to myself, but my brother heard me. He frowned, casting a cautious glance around, as if expecting to see someone watching. There was no one. The forest was still, unusually so. The usual sounds, the chirping birds, the rustling leaves, were conspicuously absent. An uneasy silence blanketed the air, and though we exchanged an uncertain glance, we shrugged it off. We were almost there, after all. Maybe someone had just been careless, we thought, leaving things behind as they passed through. We pushed on, our footsteps now softer, more hesitant. The deeper we went, the more the quiet pressed in, an oppressive weight that made every step feel heavier. The sunlight seemed to dim, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I noticed my brother glancing back every few steps, and though I wanted to reassure him, I found myself feeling the same creeping sense of dread. Soon, we stumbled across something that made us stop in our tracks. A pair of large footprints, freshly stamped into the damp earth. They were enormous, much larger than either of us could have made, and they seemed to trail along the path, leading in our direction. My brother crouched down to examine them, his face paling slightly as he traced the outline with his fingers. "Maybe it's just an animal," he whispered, though the look in his eyes suggested he didn't believe his own words. Neither did I. There was something about the shape of those footprints, the way they seemed so deliberate, like they'd been placed there with purpose. I felt my heart start to beat a little faster, and I nudged him forward, trying to keep my own nerves in check. "Come on, we're almost there," I said, forcing a calmness into my voice that felt hollow. As we continued down the path, a faint noise drifted through the trees. At first, it was so quiet that I thought I'd imagined it, a soft, rhythmic sound that barely broke through the silence. But then it grew louder, and I realized with a jolt that it was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and steady, as if someone was walking with purpose. We froze, turning slowly to look behind us, and there, at the far edge of the path, partially obscured by the shadows, was a figure, a dark, shapeless silhouette that seemed to sway with an unnatural rhythm. It was moving, its form growing larger as it sprinted toward us, closing the distance far too quickly. Panic hit me, a sharp, instinctive terror that urged me to run, to get as far away from that thing as possible. I could see the same fear mirrored in my brother's wide eyes, his face pale as he stared at the approaching figure. "Run," I whispered, my voice barely audible, and in an instant, we broke into a sprint, feet pounding against the dirt as we raced down the path, away from whatever was pursuing us. The figure's footsteps grew louder, a steady, unrelenting rhythm that seemed to echo through the trees. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. All I could think about was putting as much distance between us and that shadowy presence as possible. We ran as fast as our legs would carry us, the forest around us blurring as we focused only on the path ahead. But then, in the rush, my brother stumbled. He yelped in pain, his foot twisting at an awkward angle as he fell to the ground. I skidded to a halt, heart pounding as I looked back, seeing him clutching his ankle, his face contorted in agony. "Get up," I urged, pulling him to his feet, my hands shaking as I helped him stand. The sound of footsteps was closing in, each thud louder than the last, a relentless reminder that we didn't have time. "Come on, you can do this," I whispered, hoping my voice would somehow lend him strength. He bit his lip, wincing as he put weight on his injured foot, but he nodded, determination etched into his face. Together, we hobbled down the path, his arms slung around my shoulders as I half carried him, each step a painful, desperate attempt to escape. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I pushed forward, each step bringing us closer to safety. We could see a faint glimmer of light through the trees, the edge of the forest where our grandparents' house waited. But the figure's presence loomed behind us, a dark, menacing force that seemed to grow stronger as we neared the edge of the trees. Every step felt like a battle, but we couldn't stop. We couldn't let it catch up. So we pressed on, our fear the only thing fueling us, driving us toward the safety that lay just beyond the trees. With my brother leaning heavily against me, we moved forward, each step a painful struggle as his injured foot dragged along the ground. The glimmer of light marking the forest's edge was close now, tantalizingly within reach, but the shadow behind us felt closer. The figure's footsteps thundered through the silence, a relentless beat that seemed to grow louder, faster, as if it sensed our desperation. Every step we took seemed to stretch the distance further, the trees around us warping as though the forest itself were conspiring to keep us trapped. My breath was shallow, my lungs aching with each gasp, but I couldn't let us stop. I could feel my brother's fear as he clung to me, his face pale and strained, his eyes fixed ahead, filled with determination and terror. I tightened my grip on him, willing my legs to carry us forward. The figure's footsteps were right behind us now, impossibly close. I could almost feel its presence pressing down, a chilling force that seemed to pull at us, tugging us back with invisible hands. But we didn't stop. The edge of the forest was just ahead, a few more steps, a final push to freedom. We reached the last stretch, the faint glow of our grandparents' house visible just beyond the tree line. With renewed energy, we broke into a desperate, stumbling run. I could feel my brother's weight pressing down on me, his injury slowing us both, but I refused to let go. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest, but I kept going, forcing myself to put one foot in front of the other. Behind us, the footsteps grew erratic, the sound a disjointed cacophony as the figure seemed to shift and stagger in its pursuit. It was as if the presence sensed it was losing us, each step charged with a frantic urgency. I felt the darkness pressing in, a suffocating shroud that tightened around us, clawing at our heels. The last few yards felt like an eternity, the air thick with dread, each breath a painful, shallow gasp. Just as we broke through the line of trees, stumbling onto our grandparents' property, I glanced back, expecting to see the figure right behind us. But as we crossed into the open, the footsteps stopped. The shadow had vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence of the forest lingering behind us. We scrambled up the porch steps, practically falling against the door as we banged on it with all the strength we had left. Within moments, the door opened and our grandparents appeared, their faces etched with worry as they pulled us inside. The warmth of the house enveloped us, the familiar scent of their home, a comforting balm to our frayed nerves. I felt my brother relax slightly beside me, his breathing slowing as he leaned against the wall, clutching his injured foot. For the first time since we'd entered the forest, I felt a small measure of relief, a fragile sense of safety that settled over me. But as we caught our breath, the events of the past hour replayed in my mind. The shadowy figure, the relentless footsteps, the eerie quiet that had overtaken the forest. It felt surreal, as though we'd crossed into a different world within those woods, a place where shadows came to life and chased us down paths we thought we knew. I arrived in the abandoned neighborhood just after dawn, the streets silent and lifeless, every building a decaying relic of a time long gone. The houses, shops, and warehouses stood in various stages of ruin, their windows shattered, walls crumbling, and nature slowly reclaiming what humanity had left behind. Among these remnants, one building caught my eye, a large, unmarked structure, standing apart from the others as if forgotten by everything, even time itself. There was something about this place that felt different. I'd explored abandoned sites before, places with their fair share of history and mystery, but this building had an atmosphere that went beyond decay. Its windows were dark and gaping, the door slightly ajar, inviting yet foreboding. A cold breeze drifted from within, carrying a stale, musty scent that lingered in the air. I took a deep breath, gathering my equipment. My camera hung around my neck, and I adjusted my flashlight, ready to capture whatever secrets this place held. I couldn't ignore the faint thrill that stirred within me, a mixture of excitement and caution. I stepped inside, the old wood creaking underfoot, each step pulling me further into the unknown. As I moved through the upper levels, I kept my camera ready, snapping photos of each room, documenting every detail. Sunlight filtered through broken windows, casting long shadows across the cracked floors. The walls were covered in faded graffiti, messages and drawings from past explorers who had left their mark, each one a fragment of a story I could only imagine. I caught glimpses of dusty furniture, overturned chairs, and a broken clock frozen in time, its hands stopped at some unremarkable hour years ago. The building felt hollow, like a shell emptied of life and left to rot. Yet as I continued exploring, I began noticing small, subtle signs of recent habitation. A crumpled pack of cigarettes, an empty bottle of water, and a faint footprint in the dust near a window. My curiosity was piqued, and I felt a strange mixture of intrigue and caution. Someone else had been here recently, maybe even last night. My thoughts drifted to the possibility of squatters, but something about the scattered items felt off. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. The silence was thick, the air heavy with a staleness that made it hard to breathe. My instincts urged me to turn back, but I dismissed the thought. After all, I'd come here to document these forgotten spaces, to uncover the hidden stories within these walls. I took a deep breath and moved further inside, each step filling me with a growing sense of anticipation. Eventually, I found myself at the entrance to a narrow staircase tucked away in a corner, leading down to what appeared to be an underground level. The steps descended into pitch blackness, the darkness so absolute that even the faintest traces of light didn't reach down. A chill ran through me as I shone my flashlight into the void, illuminating a damp, cold stone floor at the bottom. I hesitated, a voice in the back of my mind telling me to turn around. But curiosity won out, as it often did in my line of exploration. I carefully made my way down, my footsteps echoing in the tight space. The temperature dropped noticeably as I descended, the air growing thicker, heavier, carrying an unsettling odor of mold and something else I couldn't identify. Each step brought me deeper into the unknown, the walls seeming to press in closer, adding to the oppressive feeling. When I reached the bottom, I paused, letting my eyes adjust to the narrow beam of light. The basement stretched out in front of me, a series of dark corridors branching off into shadows. It felt like a labyrinth, a place designed to keep secrets hidden in the dark. I took a steadying breath and began to move forward, feeling as though I was trespassing in a place that had been sealed off from the world for a reason. As I explored the basement, the feeling of intrusion grew stronger. My flashlight illuminated piles of discarded belongings, clothes, empty cans, and containers scattered across the floor, forming small islands of clutter in the vast darkness. The items looked hastily discarded, as though whoever had left them did so in a hurry. A chill prickled at the back of my neck as I realized these were signs of recent occupation, not remnants from the building's past. Someone had been living here, recently enough that the food containers hadn't yet gathered dust. I continued deeper, my footsteps cautious as I scanned the area, taking in each unsettling detail. Old clothes were piled haphazardly in the corners, some stained and torn, others arranged as though used as makeshift bedding. The walls bore strange markings, symbols and words scrawled in a language I didn't recognize. The air felt thick with a presence, an unspoken tension that filled the empty spaces, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I crouched to inspect a pile of clothing, a sudden noise echoed through the basement, a faint, shuffling sound, barely audible but unmistakable. My heart jolted, and I froze, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, the slow, deliberate footsteps moving through the darkness with a rhythm that sent a surge of dread through me. I could feel my pulse quickening, the realization dawning that I wasn't alone down here. The basement was no longer just an empty ruin. It was inhabited, and whoever was here had noticed me. I stood motionless, ears straining to catch every nuance of the sound echoing through the darkness. The footsteps were slow and steady, each one deliberate, closing in from somewhere beyond my flashlight's reach. I felt an overwhelming urge to turn and run, but my legs refused to move, rooted to the spot as my mind raced to make sense of the situation. The shuffling grew louder, reverberating through the narrow corridors of the basement, creating an illusion that the sound was all around me. My heartbeat thundered in my chest, each pulse a reminder of the vulnerable position I'd found myself in. Whoever or whatever was down here had likely been watching me since I'd entered, tracking my movements in the darkness. A sickening realization crept in. I was trapped in a maze of pitch-black corridors, with no clear memory of the path back to the staircase. The sense of isolation and exposure grew, wrapping around me like a tightening grip. As the footsteps drew nearer, I knew I couldn't stay frozen any longer. I took a step back, keeping my flashlight trained on the direction of the sound, my mind screaming at me to get out before it was too late. I turned sharply down a corridor, the flashlight shaking in my grip as I scanned the walls for any indication of an exit. I took a few hurried steps before I saw it. A shadow standing still in the middle of the hallway, waiting. The figure emerged from the darkness, a tall, thin shape with an unnatural stillness that sent a fresh wave of fear through me. My light caught the glint of glass in the figure's hand, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw it held a broken bottle, the jagged edges glistening in the faint beam. I froze, my heart pounding painfully as I took in the figure's stance. There was no doubt in my mind that this person, or whatever they were, had no intentions of letting me leave without a confrontation. The figure took a slow step forward, the bottle held out in a threatening angle, its shadow stretching toward me like a dark, clawed hand. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to put as much distance between myself and this figure as possible. Gathering every ounce of willpower, I spun on my heel, breaking into a sprint as I darted down the hallway, praying I could find the way back before it was too late. The corridors seemed endless, each turn looking identical to the last as I raced through the basement, the flashlight beam bobbing wildly. I could hear footsteps behind me, quick and relentless, their pace matching my own. My lungs burned, each breath growing shallower as I forced myself to move faster, my only thought fixed on escape. I reached a fork in the path, my heart hammering as I tried to remember the route back to the stairwell. A sudden noise, a clinking of metal or broken glass, echoed close behind, urging me forward. I turned sharply to the right, hoping my instincts would lead me in the right direction, my legs trembling with exhaustion and fear. The darkness seemed to press in, a suffocating presence that blocked out any sense of direction. I couldn't tell how close the figure was, but the threat felt imminent, its presence a heavy weight bearing down on me. Just as my strength began to falter, I spotted the faint outline of the staircase ahead. Relief surged through me, lending me one last burst of energy as I stumbled toward the steps, my mind focused solely on the promise of freedom. I scrambled up the stairs, each step echoing as I pulled myself upward, my legs shaking from the exertion. I didn't dare look back, too terrified of seeing the figure close behind. As I reached the top, I lunged forward, pushing through the door and spilling out into the cold, open air. The stale, musty scent of the basement was replaced by the faint smell of rain and earth, a stark reminder that I was no longer confined within those oppressive walls. I staggered back, catching my breath as I turned to look at the building's entrance, half expecting the figure to emerge from the shadows. But the doorway remained empty, the silence settling back over the abandoned street as if nothing had happened. I arrived at the secluded rental property just before dusk, my car crunching over gravel as I parked in front of a small cabin nestled deep in the woods. It was exactly as described, quiet, isolated, a retreat far from the noise and chaos of the city. I'd come here to escape, to disconnect, craving the solitude that only a place like this could offer. The cabin stood in a clearing surrounded by tall pines, the air heavy with the scent of earth and wood, with a gentle breeze carrying a refreshing coolness. As I unpacked my things, I felt a pleasant sense of peace settle over me. I hadn't heard a single car on the road for the last few miles, and there were no other houses in sight. I'd have the forest, the cabin, and the quiet all to myself. It was perfect. I spent the evening getting settled, unpacking, and exploring the cozy, rustic rooms, feeling the stress of daily life melt away. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the night crept in, bringing a quiet so profound that even the faintest creak in the cabin seemed to echo. Content, I turned in early, expecting nothing but restful, uninterrupted nights. The first visit came the next morning. I was sitting on the small porch, sipping coffee and listening to the sounds of the forest, when I noticed someone approaching. A man, likely a local, was walking up the path toward the cabin. He was older, dressed in worn clothes, with a friendly, if slightly too familiar, expression. I greeted him, assuming he was simply a neighbor from nearby, perhaps curious about who had rented the cabin. He lingered longer than expected, chatting about the area, recounting stories of the forest, and asking questions about my stay. It was a polite conversation, but something about his prolonged presence made me slightly uncomfortable. When he finally left, I was relieved, chalking up my unease to being caught off guard by the unexpected visitor. I shrugged it off, convinced it was just a harmless interaction. Little did I know that this was only the beginning. The following day, I was surprised to see him again. Around midday, as I was reading inside, I heard footsteps on the porch. Peeking through the window, I saw the same man from before, standing there with a slight smile, waving when he noticed me watching. He explained he was just checking in, making sure I was settling in well, and offering more information about the area. I thanked him politely, though I hoped he wouldn't stay long. Once again, however, he lingered, speaking casually about local wildlife, warning me to be cautious around the forest at night. I kept my responses short, trying to convey that I was busy, but he seemed oblivious, or perhaps unwilling to take the hint. Eventually, after a prolonged silence, he nodded and walked away, leaving me feeling unsettled. I didn't want to be rude, but I'd rented the cabin specifically for the solitude. His visits, though seemingly well-intentioned, felt like an intrusion, a disruption of the peace I'd sought. Over the next few days, his visits became a pattern. Each time, he'd show up unannounced, always with a reason, a story, a suggestion, a casual remark. But each visit grew slightly longer, more persistent. I'd come here to get away, and now I found myself anxious, wondering when he'd appear next. The peaceful seclusion I'd hoped for seemed to be slipping away, replaced by an uneasy anticipation that began to taint my stay. After another morning visit, I realized I'd had enough. The whole reason I'd chosen this place was for the quiet, for the chance to spend time alone, and his constant intrusions were wearing on me. Gathering my courage, I decided to gently but firmly ask him for some privacy. When he showed up that afternoon, I waited for a natural pause in his conversation, then politely explained that I'd come to the cabin for solitude, and I appreciated his friendliness but needed some time alone. He paused, his expression shifting. I couldn't quite place the look in his eyes, some mix of hurt and, perhaps, irritation. His friendly smile faded for a brief moment before he nodded, muttering that he understood. He added, almost as an afterthought, that he was only trying to be helpful to make my stay comfortable. His tone was cold, subtly accusatory, leaving me feeling strangely guilty for having said anything at all. After an awkward silence, he turned and left, disappearing down the path. A sense of relief washed over me, though it was tainted by an inexplicable feeling of dread. I reassured myself that I'd been polite, that my request was reasonable, but the look in his eyes haunted me. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that this would be the end of the visits. Little did I know, things were about to take a darker turn. That night, as I lay in bed, I was awoken by a sound outside. It was faint, barely audible, but distinct enough to pull me from sleep. A soft, crunching noise, like footsteps on gravel, just outside the cabin. My heart rate quickened as I strained to listen, each sound echoing in the silence. The footsteps stopped, but a new noise took its place, a faint tapping sound coming from the direction of the window. I held my breath, staring into the darkness, my mind racing through explanations. Maybe it was an animal, a branch brushing against the glass. The tapping stopped, and after a few minutes, silence returned. I forced myself to relax, convincing myself that it was nothing, just the natural sounds of the forest. But as I lay there, the silence felt different, heavy and tense, as though I wasn't alone. It took a long time to fall back asleep, my mind haunted by the brief but unnerving noises. The next night, the sounds returned. This time it was closer, louder, Footsteps around the cabin, slow and deliberate, accompanied by the occasional whisper, so faint I could barely make out the sound. I lay frozen, listening as the whispers faded, replaced by more tapping on the windows. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears as I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that it was all just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Sleep was impossible, and with each passing minute, the once cozy cabin felt more and more like a trap. The following day, I tried to shake off the unease from the night before, telling myself it had to be wildlife or just my mind playing tricks in the quiet. I kept busy, doing anything to distract myself from the anxiety building inside. But by afternoon, the familiar sound of footsteps on the gravel path broke my concentration. I felt my stomach drop when I glanced outside and saw him. The visitor, standing at the porch, looking at the cabin with that same unsettling smile. I opened the door slowly, forcing a polite expression, though every instinct screamed at me to turn him away. He greeted me with the same casual friendliness, though there was something different in his eyes, an intensity that hadn't been there before. He spoke as if nothing had changed, asking how my stay was going, his voice a little too cheerful. Despite the strained pleasantries, his gaze lingered, scanning the cabin, his eyes following me whenever I moved. I forced a laugh, saying I was busy with some work, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. But he didn't. He simply stood there, as though testing my patience, or perhaps waiting for me to invite him in. My discomfort grew with each passing second, a feeling of vulnerability washing over me. Finally, he muttered something about coming by just to make sure everything's all right, and turned to leave, casting a final, lingering look over his shoulder. I closed the door and locked it, feeling a profound sense of relief, though the tension in my chest refused to fade. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind seemed amplified, feeding my unease. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence, trying to convince myself that the visitor's unsettling behavior was harmless, that he was merely over-friendly. But as the hours wore on, the silence was broken by a new sound, the slow, unmistakable crunch of footsteps outside, circling the cabin with a deliberate rhythm that sent a chill through me. The footsteps grew louder, pausing just outside each window before moving again. My heart raced, my mind caught between the urge to investigate and the paralyzing fear of what I might see. Then came the tapping, harder this time, insistent, as though someone or something was testing the boundaries of the cabin. As I lay there frozen, I could make out faint whispers accompanying the tapping, just below the range of understanding. It was as if someone was murmuring my name, calling out softly, just beyond the walls. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping the sounds would fade, but they continued, relentless, filling the air with a menacing presence. I knew then that I couldn't stay here much longer. My solitude had been invaded, turned into something dark and dangerous. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light crept through the windows, I was already packing, throwing my things into my bags with shaking hands, desperate to be gone. The night had left a heavy weight in my chest, a gnawing fear that couldn't be rationalized away. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. I needed to leave, to put distance between myself and whatever had been outside my window. It was just another ordinary morning. I left my apartment, keys jingling in my pocket as I made my way to the car, ready to head to work. But as I approached the driver's side, I noticed something odd, a folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. Frowning, I reached for it, curiosity overriding my initial annoyance. I unfolded the paper, expecting maybe a misplaced flyer or an ad, but instead, I found a handwritten note in small, neat letters. The message was brief, vague, and unsettling. It read, "Watch your step. Not everything is as it seems." I frowned, rereading the words, trying to make sense of them. Was this some kind of prank? A mix-up? The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the lack of a name or any indication of who it was left me with a strange sense of unease. I looked around the parking lot, scanning the nearby cars and the empty sidewalk, half expecting to see someone watching from a distance. But there was no one. Just a quiet morning, an empty street, and this strange note in my hand. Shrugging it off, I crumpled the paper and tossed it in the passenger seat, deciding it wasn't worth dwelling on. Probably just a prank, I told myself, a silly attempt to rattle someone. With a dismissive shake of my head, I started the car and drove off, trying to forget about it. Little did I know that this was only the beginning. A couple of days passed, and I'd almost forgotten about the note. Life carried on as usual, the daily grind consuming most of my attention. Then, while running errands one afternoon, I returned to my car in the grocery store parking lot and saw it again. A folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper, almost identical to the last one. My heart skipped a beat as I unfolded it, and this time the message was even more specific. You've been busy today. The grocery store, the bank, and back home by noon. Take care. Someone's always watching. I felt a chill run down my spine as I reread the words. This time there was no dismissing it as a random prank. The writer knew exactly where I'd been, and the times lined up eerily with my schedule. I glanced around, my eyes darting between the cars in the parking lot, looking for anyone suspicious, anyone who might be watching me. But there was no one. The people around me were strangers, each one wrapped up in their own errands, oblivious to the creeping sense of paranoia that was settling over me. I climbed into my car, the note clutched in my hand, my mind racing with questions. Who could know my routine so well? And why would they go to the trouble of leaving these notes? As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was keeping tabs on me, monitoring my every move. But I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe someone was just trying to spook me. Still, the unease stayed with me, lurking just beneath the surface. The letters didn't stop. Over the next week, more notes appeared. Each one left on my car in various locations, at work, outside the coffee shop, even at the gym. Every note was more specific, more unnerving. They mentioned details only someone watching closely could know. The exact time I left my apartment, the exact coffee I ordered, even the shirt I'd worn on certain days. Each note was like a snapshot of my day, documenting the little things I hadn't even noticed myself. By now, paranoia had crept into every corner of my life. I found myself scanning my surroundings constantly, looking over my shoulder, my eyes lingering on strangers a little too long. Every time I stepped outside, I felt exposed, vulnerable, like an unseen eye was tracking my every movement. My daily routine had been reduced to a series of cautious glances and anxious pauses, each step forward weighted with the fear that someone was watching. The worst part was the helplessness. I had no idea who was doing this or why. I checked my apartment, my car, everywhere I could think of for hidden cameras, bugs, anything that might explain how someone was gathering these details. But there was nothing, no trace, no sign, no indication of who was behind it all. I was being watched, but by whom and from where? With each passing day, the paranoia grew, poisoning every aspect of my life. One day, desperate for answers, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started watching my surroundings more carefully, making subtle changes to my routine, testing to see if my unknown observer would notice. I took longer routes, altered my schedule, and varied the places I visited, hoping to catch someone following me, someone out of place. But the letters kept coming. Each new note matched my altered routes, mentioning every unexpected detour, every slight change in timing, each shift in location. The writer adapted, tracking my movements no matter how unpredictable I tried to be. The realization hit me like a blow. Whoever this was, they were close, observing me in ways I couldn't even fathom. I started to feel like I was losing control. Paranoia bled into every interaction, every moment of my day. I could no longer enjoy even the smallest things without the nagging thought that someone was watching. Friends and coworkers noticed the change in me, asking if I was all right, but how could I tell them? How could I explain this creeping fear without sounding irrational? With each day, the notes grew closer, more invasive, until it felt like every corner of my life was under surveillance. The letters took a darker turn as the days went by. No longer content with documenting my routine, the messages began to take on a warning tone, urging me to stay safe and be careful when you're alone. I found notes on my car warning me about potential dangers on certain streets I frequented, specific times when I was most vulnerable. The words were vague yet direct enough to make my stomach twist with dread. It felt like whoever was watching knew something I didn't, some hidden threat lurking in my own life, just beyond my view. One message in particular left me shaken. It mentioned a night I'd spent at home, alone, detailing the exact time I'd turned off my bedroom light, the moments I'd spent pacing by the window, too restless to sleep. No one could have known these details unless they'd been close, dangerously close. A deep-seated fear gripped me, the realization that my privacy had been completely violated. Whoever this was, they were crossing lines, entering spaces that were supposed to be mine alone. With every note, the fear became harder to ignore. I stopped going out as much, my anxiety intensifying to the point where even the slightest noise outside my window set me on edge. Every night was spent listening, waiting, anticipating the next intrusion, wondering if the letters were just a prelude to something worse. Then came the last letter. It was late in the evening when I found it, waiting for me on my windshield just as I stepped out of the grocery store. My hands shook as I unfolded it, the chill of the night settling in as I read the words. Danger is closer than you think. You're not as alone as you feel. My heart raced, and I felt a sinking weight in my stomach. The message was no longer just a warning, it was a threat, direct and menacing. I looked around the empty parking lot, scanning every shadow, every corner, half expecting to see someone watching, someone lurking. But the lot was still, bathed in the harsh glow of the overhead lights, and there was no one in sight. I could no longer dismiss the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The letters, each one more intrusive than the last, had stolen any sense of safety I once had. This final note was all I needed to make my decision. There was no question. I couldn't stay here anymore. My life had become a series of paranoid glances and sleepless nights, each moment marred by the knowledge that someone was watching, waiting. I needed to leave, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this unseen threat. The next morning I packed hastily, grabbing only the essentials. The usual nostalgia I felt for my belongings was absent. All I cared about was getting out, escaping the invisible eyes that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I avoided my usual routes, took random detours, anything to make sure I wouldn't be followed. The day we moved in was bright and sunny, a perfect backdrop for what should have been an exciting new chapter. The house, an old, sprawling property nestled in a quiet neighborhood, had been an incredible find. Its vintage charm, complete with antique fixtures and hardwood floors, felt like stepping back in time. As we unpacked, I could see the excitement on everyone's faces. My partner and I had finally found the place we could call home, and the kids ran through the rooms, exploring every nook and cranny. As I went from room to room, there was a strange stillness about the place. The high ceilings and large windows seemed to absorb sound, making every noise echo faintly. There was something about the quiet that felt almost too still, as if the house was listening, waiting. But I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to the unfamiliar surroundings. It was an old house, after all, bound to have its quirks. We spent the day settling in, each of us looking forward to making this space our own, oblivious to the secrets it held. It was while we were setting up the living room that we made the discovery. We had moved most of the furniture in and were arranging the bookshelves along the walls. One of the shelves was older than the others, an antique piece left behind by the previous owners, its wood worn and slightly warped. As I tried to adjust it, the shelf gave a slight wobble, and I felt a gap between the wall and the back of the shelf. Curious, I tugged at it, and to my surprise, the entire shelf began to swing outward. Behind it was a narrow door, concealed in the wall, hidden for who knew how long. My partner and I exchanged glances, both of us feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. The kids crowded around, their eyes wide with anticipation, urging us to open it. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and slowly pushed the door open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs stretched across the ceiling like ghostly decorations. The air was thick, carrying a musty scent of neglect and age. A strange feeling settled over us as we stepped inside, a sense that we were intruding on something we weren't supposed to see. We had uncovered something hidden, a secret locked away in silence. We cautiously entered the room, our footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. It was small, no more than 10 feet across, with a low ceiling and walls lined with scattered remnants of someone's life. Old clothes lay strewn across a tattered chair, their colors faded, their fabric thin and brittle. Toys, worn and broken, were piled in one corner, silent witnesses to a childhood that had long since ended. A cracked mirror rested against the wall, its surface clouded and smeared, reflecting our faces in a distorted, unsettling way. What caught my attention most were the scrawled messages on the walls, jagged words etched into the peeling wallpaper in dark ink, the letters uneven and rushed. "They are always here," one message read, its letters smudged and fading. Another said, "Keep quiet at night." The words felt heavy, filled with a fear that seemed to linger, suspended in the stale air. A chill ran through me as I took it all in, feeling an inexplicable dread creep up my spine. It was as though the walls held memories, memories that didn't want to be disturbed. The room, hidden away for who knew how long, seemed to pulse with an energy that felt wrong, a sense that we weren't welcome. The excitement we'd felt was quickly fading, replaced by an unease that settled over us like a shadow. In one corner of the room, partially hidden under a pile of faded books, I found a small, dusty envelope. The paper was yellowed and brittle, as though it had been left untouched for years. I picked it up carefully, brushing away the dust, and opened it to find a single sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was shaky, hurried, as if written in a moment of desperation. The note recounted a dark history of the house, detailing the lives of its previous occupants in fragmented sentences. It mentioned multiple break-ins, times when they'd woken to find doors unlocked that had been bolted shut the night before. The former residents wrote about strange sounds echoing through the halls at odd hours, footsteps that paced outside their bedroom doors, whispers just out of earshot, tapping on windows that left no trace. The final line was what truly unnerved me. "If you hear them, don't try to find them. They'll find you." My hands trembled as I finished reading, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and disbelief. It felt like a warning, as if whoever had written it had known that someone else would one day stand in this room, reading their desperate message. I looked around, meeting my partner's eyes, both of us recognizing the same unease in each other. This wasn't just an old room with leftover belongings. It was a place that had witnessed something dark, something that had seeped into its walls. That night, we settled in uneasily, each of us haunted by the discoveries in the hidden room. Sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed the scrawled messages, the broken toys, the ominous note warning us about the sounds. I tried to reassure myself that it was nothing, just remnants of a family with an overactive imagination, people who had let their fears get the best of them. But as the house settled around us, each creak seemed amplified, filling the silence with an unspoken tension. Around midnight, just as I began to drift off, I heard it. Faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing just outside our bedroom door. My heart raced as I strained to listen, each step resonating with a hollow weight that made my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself it was one of the kids wandering in the night, but a quick glance confirmed they were both asleep, tucked safely in their beds. The footsteps continued, steady, moving from room to room as if someone were searching for something, or someone. My partner and I lay still, both of us holding our breath, unwilling to disturb whatever presence might be outside. It was as if the entire house had come alive, every shadow and creak joining in a whispered warning that we were not alone. Sleep was impossible. We lay there, eyes wide open, listening as the sounds faded, leaving only an unsettling quiet that lingered until dawn. The next morning, we all gathered at the breakfast table, each of us worn from a night of broken sleep. I cautiously brought up the footsteps, half expecting my partner or the kids to laugh it off. But as I spoke, I saw the same haunted look in their eyes, a shared understanding that none of us wanted to admit. Over the following days, the sounds grew more frequent, more distinct, as though they were creeping closer with each passing night. Sometimes it was just the footsteps, other times soft, unintelligible whispers that seemed to float through the walls, just beyond reach. Every member of the family began to feel the strain, an unspoken fear that we couldn't escape, a sense that something unseen was watching us, waiting. Even during the day, we couldn't shake the feeling. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corners of my vision, a flicker of a shadow slipping out of sight. The kids grew anxious, constantly looking over their shoulders, clinging to me whenever a door creaked or a window rattled. The house, once filled with laughter and excitement, had turned into a place of dread, each room haunted by the sense of something lurking just out of sight. On the fifth night, the disturbances reached a terrifying peak. We were all in our rooms, trying to sleep despite the constant feeling of being watched, when a loud, deliberate knock sounded on the walls, as though someone were pounding on every surface at once. The noise reverberated through the house, filling every corner with a force that left us frozen in fear. The kids were crying, clutching their blankets, while my partner and I sat up, paralyzed, unable to comprehend what was happening. The knocking stopped, replaced by a silence that was even more suffocating. But the dread remained, a tangible weight pressing down on us, leaving no doubt that we weren't welcome here. That was the breaking point. In that moment, we knew we couldn't stay. The house, with its charming facade and spacious rooms, was a place we could never truly call home. Whatever haunted these walls, whatever lingered in that hidden room, wanted us gone. We made the decision right then and there to leave, gathering only what we could carry, driven by a primal need to escape. We left the house at dawn, the rising sun casting long shadows over the property as we piled into the car, too shaken to look back. The office was unusually quiet as I worked late. The hum of the computer and the faint whir of the heating system, the only sounds filling the space. I was one of the last people in the building, and I usually enjoyed the peace that came with it. There was something calming about the stillness, the way the city lights glowed softly through the windows, casting a dim glow over the empty cubicles. It allowed me to focus, to lose myself in my work without distractions. As the hours slipped by, I typed away, the night deepening around me. But then, in the middle of the silence, I heard it, a faint sound, almost indiscernible, coming from down the hall. I paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, listening. It sounded like footsteps, soft and deliberate, as if someone were walking slowly through the empty space. I shook my head, brushing it off as my imagination or the building's usual creaks and groans. I'd been here plenty of late nights before, and these old buildings had a way of making odd noises. I returned to my work, though a faint feeling of unease lingered, creeping into my thoughts. I continued working, determined to finish the tasks I'd set for the night. But the noises didn't stop. Every so often I'd hear something, a soft rustle, the faint scrape of a chair being moved, as if someone was walking between the desks. I frowned, glancing down the dimly lit rows of cubicles, seeing nothing but shadows and empty spaces. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a look around, if only to ease my mind. I stood up, walking slowly down the hallway, peering around corners and checking the empty rooms as I went. But everything was exactly as it should be. Desks were neat and orderly, chairs pushed in, papers stacked neatly on surfaces. There was no sign of anyone else in the building. I returned to my desk, a prickling sense of discomfort settling over me. The quiet was no longer calming. It felt oppressive, like a heavy presence lingering just out of sight. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me after hours of staring at the screen. Still, the feeling lingered, a faint tension that made every sound sharper, every shadow darker. As I sat back down, I tried to ignore the unsettled feeling gnawing at me. I focused on my work, telling myself it was almost done, that I'd be able to go home soon and leave this eerie silence behind. But the building seemed to disagree. The noises returned, louder this time, footsteps, unmistakable, approaching from down the hall, growing closer with each step. My heart beat faster as I listened, the sound filling the space with an unnatural weight. I glanced toward the hallway, half expecting to see someone walk by, but no one appeared. The footsteps stopped just outside my view, lingering for a moment before fading away. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. The thought chilled me, filling me with an instinctive need to leave. Deciding enough was enough, I saved my work and began shutting everything down, my hands shaking slightly as I gathered my things. I wasn't sure what I'd heard or what was making those sounds, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. The walk to the elevator felt longer than usual, the hallway stretching out before me in the dim, artificial light. I could feel the silence pressing in, amplifying every soft creak, every whisper of air moving through the building. I quickened my pace, the unease from earlier deepening with each step. As I reached the elevator, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the rows of empty cubicles, the vacant desks and chairs, half expecting to see a shadow lurking in the darkness. But the office was empty, just as it had been all night. I stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the ground floor, my heart pounding as the doors slid shut. For the first time, I was relieved to be leaving, eager to escape the strange atmosphere that had taken hold of the place. As I stepped out of the building into the cool night air, I took a deep breath, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. But despite the open air and the sound of distant traffic, I couldn't quite shake the feeling of being watched. I made my way down the quiet streets, the cool night air helping to calm my nerves. I tried to dismiss the strange noises from the office as an overactive imagination. But as I walked, that same prickling sensation of being watched crept back, settling into the base of my spine. I glanced behind me, expecting to see an empty street, but instead I noticed a figure trailing a short distance back. At first I told myself it was just another late-night commuter, someone heading home like I was. But as I continued walking, taking random turns to test my suspicion, the figure kept pace, matching my every move. They didn't try to hide it, maintaining a steady distance, shadowing me with a patience that felt deliberate. My heart raced, and I felt a wave of fear wash over me as the reality of the situation sank in. I was being followed. I quickened my pace, hoping to put some distance between us, but they did the same. Every time I stole a glance over my shoulder, the figure was there, unwavering. The sense of vulnerability I'd felt in the office had followed me, morphing into something sharper, more dangerous. My anxiety turned to panic. I picked up my pace, walking faster, glancing around for anyone else nearby, someone who could help if things took a turn. But the streets were empty, the late hour robbing me of any chance for help. The figure kept their distance, but maintained a steady pace, their movements calm, as though they had all the time in the world. Desperation kicked in, and I broke into a run, darting down side streets and weaving through alleys, hoping to lose them. My footsteps echoed loudly in the silence, and I could hear theirs in sync with mine, relentless and steady. I turned corner after corner, my breaths coming in short, panicked bursts, but each time I glanced back, they were still there, a dark shadow just at the edge of my vision, keeping pace effortlessly. Finally, I spotted a crowded plaza up ahead, filled with late-night pedestrians milling about under the streetlights. I pushed through the crowd, weaving between people, my heart pounding as I fought to lose the figure in the sea of strangers. When I finally looked back, they were gone, swallowed by the crowd, leaving only the echo of my racing heart and the lingering chill of fear. I didn't relax until I was safely back at my apartment, the door locked securely behind me. I leaned against it, catching my breath, the adrenaline slowly fading. Despite the familiar comfort of home, I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me like a shadow. The apartment felt different, each corner darker, each creak louder, as though it shared the tension of my escape. I went through the apartment, double-checking the locks on every window, every door, making sure there was no way for anyone to enter. The fear of being followed had left me on edge, and I found myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see that figure standing on the street below, watching my every move. But the street was empty, silent, with only the occasional passing car breaking the stillness. Though I was safe, the unease hadn't disappeared. It had settled into my mind, a constant, nagging feeling that I wasn't truly alone. As I tried to settle in for the night, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, feeling the weight of invisible eyes, as though the sensation of being watched had followed me home. I lay in bed, exhausted but unable to sleep, each minute stretching painfully as the silence pressed down on me. Every creak of the building, every distant sound outside seemed amplified, each one setting my nerves on edge. I tried to tell myself that the night was over, that I was safe now, but the sense of being watched lingered, seeping into every shadowed corner of my mind. The night shift had always suited me. The quiet, the routine, the steady glow of surveillance monitors. It was predictable, comforting even. Most nights passed without incident, just the dull hum of machines keeping me company as I watched over the empty corridors and dimly lit rooms of the building. The building was large, a multi-story office complex that shut down completely after hours. Once the employees left, it was just me, the cameras, and the soft, constant hum of the fluorescent lights. That night began as any other. I did my rounds, checking each floor, ensuring all doors were locked and the alarms set. The building's silence was deep, almost soothing, its halls stretching out in orderly lines on the screens in front of me. I returned to the surveillance room, settling in with a cup of coffee, fully prepared for another uneventful night. But as the hours ticked by, something felt off. It was hard to pinpoint, but the silence seemed heavier than usual, pressing down around me like a weight. I shrugged it off as exhaustion. It was nearing midnight, and the empty halls could make anyone feel a bit uneasy. Still, the feeling lingered, like a shadow at the edge of my thoughts. I was watching the monitors, mindlessly cycling through the views from different cameras, when something caught my eye. On the screen showing the back hallway, a place no one should have been after hours, I saw movement. At first, it was just a shadow, barely visible, shifting at the edge of the frame. I leaned closer, squinting, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then it appeared clearly. A shadowy figure, indistinct but unmistakable, moving slowly down the empty hall. My first instinct was to believe it was a trick of the camera, some kind of interference or glitch. But as I watched, the figure moved, almost gliding along the floor, until it paused directly in front of the camera, standing still as if aware it was being watched. My heart pounded as I stared, trying to make out any distinguishing features. But the figure was just a dark silhouette, shapeless and undefined, as though made of pure shadow. I hesitated, my mind racing through explanations. A prank? An intruder? I couldn't shake the sense of something unnatural. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight, determined to investigate. I walked briskly to the back hallway, each step echoing loudly in the silent building. When I reached the corridor, I found nothing. Just an empty stretch of floor, the overhead lights casting a dim glow across the spotless tiles. My flashlight scanned the space, illuminating every corner, every shadow. The hall was as silent and empty as it had been during my rounds earlier. Puzzled, I returned to the surveillance room, chalking it up to fatigue or a minor malfunction with the cameras. But as soon as I sat down, the figure reappeared. This time, it was closer, lingering at the end of the hall as though waiting for me. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I stared at the screen, watching as the figure moved, slowly and deliberately, before vanishing once again. Frustrated and unsettled, I returned to the back hallway, determined to catch whoever or whatever was causing this. But when I arrived, the space was once again empty, filled only with silence and an eerie stillness. My heart raced as I stood there, feeling like a fool, yet unable to shake the feeling that something had been there moments before. I returned to my post, more confused than ever. For the next 2 hours, the pattern repeated itself. I would see the figure on the monitors, always in the same hallway, its shadowy form moving almost aimlessly, but with a sense of purpose that I couldn't quite understand. Each time I went to investigate, the area was empty, as if the figure had vanished into thin air. It never stayed on the screen for long, only appearing briefly before fading into the shadows. Each appearance seemed more deliberate than the last. The figure lingered a little longer each time, its movements almost taunting. It felt as if it were watching me, aware of my frustration and helplessness. I couldn't shake the creeping dread that grew with every sighting, the feeling that I was playing a game I couldn't understand, with something I couldn't explain. By the third or fourth time, I was starting to doubt my own senses. I checked the cameras, reset the equipment, did everything I could think of to rule out a malfunction. But nothing changed. The figure appeared and disappeared, following the same pattern, leaving me with a gnawing sense of dread that I couldn't ignore. I realized that whatever was happening was beyond my control, and as the hours dragged on, I became painfully aware that I was alone, trapped in the building with something that shouldn't have been there. By now, the routine had worn me down. Each time I saw the figure on the monitor, my stomach twisted, fear rooting itself deeper. I began to question if I was really seeing what I thought I was seeing. Exhaustion clawed at me, and I tried to convince myself that it was simply fatigue playing tricks on my mind. Maybe I was just seeing shadows, or the camera's old wiring was malfunctioning, creating ghostly shapes. But as I stared at the screen, I noticed something unsettling. The figure was becoming clearer, its shape more defined. I could make out the faint outline of shoulders, the curve of a face obscured in darkness. Even though the image was still distorted, something about it was disturbingly human. It felt as if the figure was staring back, aware of my gaze, lingering just long enough to make sure I knew it was there. I rubbed my eyes, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on me. But each time I looked up, the figure reappeared, drifting closer to the camera with an eerie calm. The fear grew, an insidious, creeping dread that left me feeling more isolated, more vulnerable, with each passing moment. The silence around me seemed to thicken, each sound amplified, each shadow filled with potential menace. The figure returned just before dawn, this time in the hallway closest to the surveillance room. My heart stopped as I watched it on the monitor, only one room away. I felt an intense, primal fear, a sense that this figure, whatever it was, had somehow crossed a boundary, inching closer to where I sat. I couldn't move, my body frozen as I watched it drift toward the camera, its shadow swallowing the corridor's light. The figure paused directly in front of the lens, filling the screen with its dark shape. Its face, or what I thought might be its face, tilted slightly, as though studying me, evaluating my reaction. It lingered there, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity. The room around me grew colder, an unnatural chill settling into my bones. I felt as if I were being watched, not just on the screen, but in the room itself. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only an empty hallway and the faint, residual dread that it had left behind. I was shaken to the core, my mind racing with explanations that I knew couldn't be true. This was no malfunction. I couldn't rationalize it away any longer. Whatever I was seeing wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The fear had finally broken me. As the first hint of dawn began to light the sky, I knew I couldn't stay here a moment longer. I didn't care about protocol, didn't care about securing the building, I just wanted out. Gathering my things hastily, I took one last look at the monitors, my hands trembling as I noticed each hallway, each empty room, now seemed darker, as if tainted by the figure's presence. I walked through the building one last time, every step echoing in the oppressive silence. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, the sense that something was watching from the shadows, hiding just out of sight. I moved quickly, my footsteps reverberating through the empty corridors, my heart racing with a growing desperation to escape. As I reached the exit, I hesitated, feeling a final, chilling urge to look back. I scanned the hallway behind me, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me leave. But the hall was empty, the silence absolute.